Welcome back, everybody, to the Fresh Catholic Bible Study Series, Gospel of Mark edition. I'm Charles Merritt, and today we're going to be unpacking 5 events that Mark records in chapter 12. Now, again, keep in mind, Mark is 16 chapters long. We're going to be doing chapter 12 today. And as of the last chapter, chapter 11, in Mark's Gospel, that's when he starts recording the events of Holy Week. So in Mark's Gospel, from chapter 11, which we did last episode, all the way to the end, Mark is going to be recording various events of Holy Week. So chapter 12, we're going to take a look at 5 more events of Holy Week, 1 parable that Jesus teaches, and 3 questions that various sects of the Jewish religious leaders' system posed him. Now, remember in previous episodes, and I gave you a fair warning, between now all the way through Holy Week, each component of the Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Herodians, they're each going to pose a question to Jesus. That's not really a question. It's really a trap in an attempt to discredit him in front of the crowds. We've seen a couple of instances of that already, a couple of examples. And in each case, rather than discrediting Jesus, Jesus turns the tables on them and discredits them. And we had said, well, you would think now, a couple of questions in, that they would have learned their lesson and not try and trap Jesus. Well, evidently, again, like we've been saying, they don't, because in chapter 12, Mark records 3 more attempts in this chapter alone where various parts of the Jewish religious system pose a question to trap Jesus, and in every single case, Jesus turns the tables on them, and it's not he that's discredited, it's them. So 1 parable, 3 questions, and then the chapter wraps up with the kind of famous event called the widow's mite. So with that said, let's dive in, and again, let's locate ourselves as to where we are in Holy Week. Now again, chapter 11, Mark starts his recording of Holy Week. And in chapter 11, we saw Jesus make his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We saw him curse the fig tree, and we saw him cleanse the temple. Those are the first 3 events Mark records in Holy Week. Now, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, that was Sunday. The cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple was Monday. So as we go through these chapters in Mark, as he takes us through the events of Holy Week, I'll kind of let you know, chapter by chapter, event by event, what day during Holy Week it matches up with. So again, last chapter, chapter 11, triumphal entry, that was Sunday. Cursing of the fig tree, cleansing of the temple, that was Monday. As we move into this episode's chapter 12, we are now in Tuesday of Holy Week. So if you're kind of paralleling these events with what days they happened during the original Holy Week, chapter 11, Sunday and Monday, this chapter 12, Tuesday. Now again, each day, Jesus and his disciples are going into Jerusalem, and then at the end of the day, they're going back to Bethany to spend the night. So now as we move into chapter 12 and move into Tuesday of Holy Week, Monday evening, last evening, so to speak, they went back to Bethany, spent a night. Now it's Tuesday, they're coming back into Jerusalem. And on this day, Jesus is going to be in the temple area, and he's going to be doing a lot of teaching. And it's during these teachings that he gives the parable, which we'll look at first, and it's during these teachings that each of the 3 different sects of the Jewish religious leaders pose a question to him. So in your mind's eye, picture Tuesday morning, Jesus and his disciples have gone back into Jerusalem, they're at the temple, and Jesus is teaching. And we pick up with chapter 12 with the first event Mark records, which is called the parable of the vineyard. And it consists of verses 1 through 12 of this chapter. Now, let me give you kind of a historical and cultural context, and then we'll dive into the parable. Okay, now remember, a parable, an earthly story with a spiritual meaning, And the earthly story that he gives them is always based on something they know well, something they experience, something they see, something they do every single day. So that's a parable. This particular parable is a parable of the vineyard. Now, what would happen is, at this point in time, first century Israel, right? You'd have the wealthier landowners, and they would own land, and they would have vineyards on that land, right? And because they were wealthy, they certainly didn't work the vineyards. And because they were wealthy, a lot of times they would be kind of absentee landlords, so to speak. Because of their wealth, they would travel. So when they traveled, they would have people basically, in charge of the vineyard, safeguarding it, and making sure that its operation kept going while the owner, the landlord, was away, okay? These people would work the vineyard, and when the owner returned, obviously he would expect the normal amount of produce to be produced, right? And then the workers that he left in charge of the vineyard, they would get their pay. So that's how kind of a lot of the vineyards of the wealthier landowners operated. They owned the land, they owned the vineyard, they would often travel, and while they were absent, they would hire people to work the vineyard, to bring in the crop, to safeguard the vineyard for a certain amount of money. That's kind of the deal. So you want to have that kind of situation in the back of your mind, okay? Now, Jesus uses this very familiar situation as the basis of teaching this parable, the parable of the vineyard. So, let's go from the earthly to the spiritual. Now, the vineyard, like I mentioned, had an owner, okay? Spiritually speaking, that owner is God. The vineyard itself stood for the nation of Israel. The people that were left in charge of the vineyard and worked the vineyard while the landlord was away, those are the Jewish religious leaders. The servants that the landlord, that the owner sends to kind of make sure that the people working the vineyard are actually working the vineyard, those servants stand for the prophets. And the son that the owner, that the landlord eventually sends, that stands for Jesus. So in a normal vineyard, okay, you'd have the owner, and in the spiritual sense, that's God. You'd have a vineyard, that's the nation of Israel. You'd have people left in charge to safeguard and work the vineyard, those are the Jewish religious leaders. You had people the owner would send from time to time to check up on these guys that were working and safeguarding the vineyard. Those are the servants, those are the prophets. And then the son that the owner would eventually send, he's Jesus. So, each individual in this earthly setting has a spiritual counterpart, okay? Now, as we read through the parable, we'll notice a couple of things, okay? Number one, because this parable, again, he's giving it to the crowd. And part of the crowd are the Jewish religious leaders. So he's addressing this parable as much to them as he is to the crowd. One could argue, in fact, he's addressing it more to them than he is to the crowd. Because again, Jesus is God. He knows that the Jewish religious leaders are plotting to arrest him and have him killed. He knows that. And despite that, this parable, once we go through it, we'll realize it's an attempt, one of several attempts Jesus makes as Holy Week kind of rolls out. It's an attempt by Jesus to reach out to the Jewish religious leaders, have them kind of take stock of what they're thinking of doing and not go through with it, okay? It's, these teachings, these parables we see during Holy Week really shows us the love and mercy of Jesus in that, knowing these people are planning to arrest and kill him, he nevertheless continues to reach out, literally almost to the last minute, for them to say, hey, look at what you're doing. Take stock of what you're doing. It's not too late to stop. It's not too late to change your course. So he's continually reaching out to them. But as we'll see, even though the Jewish religious leaders realize that he's talking about them and their plot to arrest him and kill them, even though they realize this parable is directed at them, they still don't change course. Their hearts are that hardened. So really, this parable, as we go through it, in the background, we want to keep in mind that it speaks to the love and mercy of Jesus and an attempt to reach out to the Jewish religious leaders, have them take stock of what they're planning to do, and telling them it's not too late to change course. It's not too late to change your minds. And sadly, for them, they don't. So Jesus rolls out this parable, right? And he rolls it out exactly the way this situation would work. He said, okay, guys, there's a vineyard, all right, and there's an owner, a wealthy owner, and now he's going to be absent. So he hires some people to work the vineyard in his absence and bring in the crops and safeguard the vineyard, right? And he's going to send some people every once in a while to check and make sure that the vineyard is operating as it should, so that when he eventually comes back, the crops will be picked. He'll be able to pay off those guys. And, that's the way it goes, right? So Jesus rolls out this parable exactly the way, if you're part of this crowd, exactly the way you would see a vineyard of a wealthy absentee landlord operate. The people here, including the Jewish religious leaders, they would be very, very familiar with this parable, okay? So, how does he roll it out, right? Now, keep in mind, the vineyard is the nation of Israel. The people hired to take care. Remember, the owner's God. The vineyard is the nation of Israel. The people hired to take care of it and safeguard it are the Jewish religious leaders, right? And the servants are the prophets. So he's telling these guys, look, this is the situation right now. You guys who are put in charge of the Jewish religious system in the nation of Israel, you guys who are responsible for leading people to me, to God, okay? You're not doing it. You're not working the vineyard the way you should, all right? You're not safeguarding the vineyard the way you should. Therefore, what I've done is I've sent prophets down through the ages to warn you guys. And you disregarded the prophets. You beat some of them up. You killed others. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to eventually send my own son, all right, to kind of warn you of the path you're on. And you'll take my son and you'll kill him, which is exactly what God has done. He sent the nation of Israel prophet after prophet after prophet, telling them, look, if you obey, these are going to be the blessings. If you disobey, these are going to be the curses. This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Prophet after prophet. And they were ignored. And in a lot of cases, they were killed. And now God is sending his son, right? And he's going to be killed. So this parable parallels exactly what's been happening, okay? But let's go behind the scenes in the parable, because the parable tells us a couple of very interesting things about God, about Jesus, and about man, us. Now, in terms of what it tells us about God, consider the following things. This parable tells us of the generosity of God, because if you look at the parable, the vineyard had everything it possibly could have to be fruitful, okay? It had a wall around it to protect it from predators. It had a tower. It had a wine press. It had a wine vat. So the vineyard was equipped with everything it needed to be equipped with to bear fruit, right? That speaks to the generosity of God. Also, this parable speaks to the trust of God, because the landlord goes away and has other people work and manage his vineyard, right? God has the Jewish religious leaders working and safeguarding his vineyard, trusting that they would do a good job of it, which they're not. But again, this speaks to the trust of God in leaving others to work and safeguard his vineyard. The other thing it shows us is the patience of God, because in the parable, the landowner would send servant after servant after servant to check on the produce, all right? He doesn't send just one. He sends servant after servant after servant, just like God has sent prophet after prophet after prophet. So this parable speaks to the patience of God. It also speaks to the ultimate justice of God, because yes, he's generous. Yes, he's trusting. Yes, he's patient. But ultimately, there is a day of reckoning. Ultimately, there is a judgment, because in the parable, at the end of the parable, what happens? The vineyard is taken away from these people and given to somebody else. So if you're looking at this parable, it really kind of highlights four kind of attributes, four aspects of God's character. His generosity, his trust, his patience, and ultimately his justice. The parable also shows us a couple of things about Jesus himself, okay? Notice in the parable, the landowner sends servants, okay, one servant after another. And then he sends his son. He sends servants, and then he sends his son, distinguishing his son from the servants. Now, who are the servants? Spiritually speaking, the prophets. Who is his son? Jesus. So in separating the son from the servants, Jesus is indicating, look, I'm not another prophet. I am the Son. So it indicates that Jesus, all right, is more than just a good teacher, more than just a good moralist, more than just a good rabbi, more than just a good prophet. He is the Son. So, and this parable, in separating, distinguishing the servants from the sons, gives us that indication. It also tells us that Jesus knew he was going to die, because in giving him this parable, he's telling him the owner sends the son is killed, right? Well, who's the son? The son is him. So it shows us he knew, being God, of course, he's going to die. So Calvary, the cross, doesn't come as a surprise to him. He's not blindsided by it. By teaching this parable, he is indicating to the Jewish religious leaders, look, I know what you're going to do. I know you're going to kill me, because in the parable, they killed the son. The they is you, and the son is me. So it tells us those two things about Jesus. It also tells us a couple of things about man, about you and I, right? And that is that, think about it, okay? Here are the people in the parable that the owner puts in charge of the vineyard, right? And they're not working the vineyard the way they should. They're mismanaging it. They're not working the vineyard, so the vineyard is not going to produce what it should produce, right? Now, in the parable, these guys know that, right? They know, hey, we've been put in charge of this vineyard. We should work it. We should have the produce ready, so when the owner comes back, the vineyard has produced to the max. They know they're not doing their job, right? They know they're mismanaging the vineyard. But apparently, they figured, well, the owner's away, he's not going to know, or he's not going to have any power to do anything. So who cares? Yes, we're mismanaging the vineyard, but the owner is absent. He's unaware of what we're doing, or he's powerless to do anything about it. Now, what does that tell us about us? Okay. Well, sometimes we get into that mode, right? Sometimes we say, oh, we're doing these sins, we're behaving this way. But God, he's absent. He doesn't know what we're doing. He can't see what we're doing. He's unaware. And even if he knows and sees, at the end of the day, he's a big teddy bear. He's just going to wink at sin. And, everybody's going to go to heaven. So there's not much to worry about, right? So in the parable, spiritually, matches up with actually what it is, okay? The workers mismanaging the owner's vineyard, killing the servants and eventually killing the son. The Jewish religious leaders mismanaging the vineyard of the Lord, the nation Israel, killing the prophets and eventually killing the son. So there's that direct parallel, earthly story, spiritual meaning. But behind the parable, it really highlights a couple of things about God, a couple of things about Jesus himself, and a couple of things about you and I that maybe we didn't see lurking behind the scenes when we kind of read this parable previously. But now that you're looking at this podcast, now you know. So a very powerful parable, and like we said, that the Jewish religious leaders, they knew he was talking about them and what they were doing and what they planned to do, but it didn't penetrate their heart because they went through with it anyway. So that's the first event in chapter 12, verses 1 to 12, the parable of the vineyard. Then as we move through chapter 12, we'll see various groups, one at a time, come up to Jesus, pose a question to try and trap him and discredit him. Now, the first event in this chapter, the first question in this chapter Mark talks about, the Pharisees and the Herodians are the ones that approach Jesus. Now, we've already introduced ourselves to the Pharisees in a previous chapter, in a previous episode. Just by way of quick review, they are the Jewish religious leaders that have taken it upon themselves to make sure that the people never again violated the covenant, violated the Mosaic law. So they built in all kinds of very minute rules and laws so that the people didn't come close to coming close to violating the law and violating the covenant, okay? They made the religious system so burdensome, and they basically took it away from worship of God to basically following their own rules and regulations. So that's who the Pharisees were. We got introduced to them in a previous episode. The Herodians, they were another aspect, right? And as their name suggests, Herodians, Herod, they were loyal to Herod. They were more political than they were religious. And what their main job, or their main goal was, in order to kind of keep our position, we always had to curry favor with Herod. So they were more political than they were religious, okay? Even though they were part of the Jewish religious system, their main job was not to bring people to God, right? It was to kind of curry favor with Herod so they can maintain their position in the pecking order. So you've got the religious aspect, the Pharisees, and the political aspect, the Herodians. They combine forces now, and they approach Jesus with a question they think, haven't we heard this before, with a question they think there's no way Jesus can get out of. We're going to trap him on that horns of a dilemma. Whatever way he answers it, he's going to be wrong. And since we're posing this question in the temple area where Jesus is teaching crowds, he'll be discredited in front of everybody, and that'll bring the people back to us. That's their thinking. So what's their question? All right. This is verses 13 to 17 in chapter 12. And again, just like the couple of questions we saw previously, the three that we'll see in this chapter, on the surface, they look brilliant. On the surface, they look foolproof, okay? but they're posing him to Jesus, who is God. But they don't see him as such. So here's the question, right? They come up to Jesus. We know this question well. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Simple question, right? They're expecting a yes or no answer. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Jesus can go one of two ways. Yes, it is lawful, or no, it's not. All right? Now, let's talk a little background here. When they say, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Well, again, keep in mind, if you're a Jewish person at this point in time, you are under the thumb of Rome, right? Roman is the occupier. They are in charge. And one of the things they do is they tax. They tax and they tax and they tax. So, you mention Caesar to a Jewish person, negative response, because he's in charge of this nation that's oppressing you. You mention taxes to a Jewish person, another negative response, because you're getting taxed to death by Caesar in Rome. All right? So, it's no coincidence that the nature of this question revolves around taxes to Caesar, because taxes is a bad word if you're a Jewish person. Caesar is a bad word if you're a Jewish person. Keep that in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about taxes, okay? There were three main taxes that Rome was levying on people. Number one, there was what's called a ground tax. And that basically taxed all of the produce that you grew from the ground, okay? So the ground tax is if you produce grain, if you grew like barley or wheat, whatever, a tenth of all the grain you produced, you'd have to hand over to Rome. If what you were involved in was wine, if you owned a vineyard, a third of all the grapes your vineyard produced would have to be turned over to Rome. If you grew produce, if that's what you did on your land, a fifth of all your produce would have to be turned over to Rome. That was the ground tax. Whatever you grew from the ground, hence ground tax, you had to take a certain percentage right off the top, hand it over to Rome, okay? And then there was an income tax, right? 1%. So the portion off the top that didn't go to Rome, that you were able to sell and make a living off of, get some income off of, 1% of the income you derived from what you had left, that was turned over to Rome, okay? And then there was what's called a poll tax. And that was levied on men from 14 to 65 and on women from 12 to 65. And you were taxed basically just for existing. So you were taxed based on what you grew or what you produced. You were taxed on the income you got from that. And you were taxed merely by being alive. So when taxes are mentioned to a Jewish person, that was a very, very negative word. So with that background, in front of the crowds, the Pharisees and the Herodians come up to Jesus in front of everybody and they say, hey, we got a question for you. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Taxes, bad word. Caesar, bad word. Okay? Now, if you're Jesus and this question's coming at you, it's basically yes or no, right? Well, here's the problem. Here's the horns of the dilemma they hoped this question would put Jesus on, okay? They're thinking to themselves, okay, once we pose this question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? If Jesus says yes, pay taxes to Caesar, remember, taxes is a bad word. Caesar's a bad word. So if Jesus says pay taxes to Caesar, okay, that's not going to go over well with the Jewish people. And the thinking is he's going to lose them. If Jesus says no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then he's committing treason and sedition. And Rome is not going to like that. So they're thinking either way Jesus, and if you're tracking with me here, either way Jesus answers these questions, he's going to be in trouble with somebody. If he says pay the taxes, he's going to be in trouble with the Jewish people. If he says don't pay the taxes, he's going to be in trouble with the Roman authorities. So either way, Jesus is in a no-win situation, right? So they pose this question in front of the crowds in the temple area. It's hanging out there, and they go, now we got him. Because either way he loses, right? It's a lose-lose. Well, as we'll see, okay, Jesus splits the difference on him, okay? He doesn't take the bait of yes or no. They're posing it as an either or. Jesus answers it as a both and. Because look what Jesus says, okay? He says, look, okay? He says, show me a coin. And they show him a coin. And the coin, a Roman coin, on the heads part of it, so to speak, would have the image of Caesar on it. And it would, underneath the image of Caesar, would be an inscription, divine Caesar. Because Caesar was looked at as kind of divine, because of kind of a demigod with a small g, okay? So on the head side would be an image of Caesar, who considers himself divine. That would be sacrilegious. And on the flip side would be an inscription that indicated that he is the high priest of the nation of Rome, which also would be, sacrilegious, right? So the Roman coin was very sacrilegious, right? So Jesus says, show me a coin. They show him a coin, all right? And he says, whose image is on it? And they, of course, say Caesar's. And then he says, okay, then if Caesar's image is on the coin, give him the coin. Render to Caesar what is Caesar. Pay him his taxes. Pay him his coin. Okay? But render to God what is God. Now, the key here is image. Whose image is on the coin? Caesar's image. So pay the coin to Caesar. But who's made in the image and likeness of God? We are. So give Caesar his coins, give him his taxes, but give God your lives. So Jesus indicates you can do both, right? Now, if you're part of the crowd, you're going, oh, he got you, right? And the Pharisees and the Herodians, as we've seen previous questions, they slink away with their tails between their legs, so to speak, because rather than discrediting Jesus in front of the crowds, he discredits them, okay? They give him an either or, he returns a both and. Give Caesar his coin, he has his image on that. Give God your lives, you're made in his image. So, but that doesn't dissuade the Jewish religious leaders, right? Because here come the Sadducees. And in verses 18 to 27, they pose their question. It's as if the Sadducees have been kind of waiting off in line going, the Pharisees and the Herodians, boy, they really blew that. But we got a question now that is bound to trap them, okay? They took their shot. They went down in flames. But our question, this is really going to discredit them. And these are the Sadducees. Now, who are the Sadducees? The Sadducees were very wealthy. They were part of the aristocracy. The priests in the temple were drawn from this group. The high priest was drawn from this group. Okay, so that's who they were. Now, they only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, the Torah, the Pentateuch. They only accepted the first 5 books, all right? So for them, the Old Testament was only the first 5 books, right? And because, in their estimation, nowhere in the first 5 books references, the resurrection, the afterlife. They didn't believe in the afterlife. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the concept of immortality. They didn't believe in angels, okay? So, because they didn't believe in the resurrection, because they didn't think there was any proof of it in the first 5 books, all right, they attempt to ask a question to Jesus that basically brings out how ridiculous this concept of resurrection is. Because Jesus is, remember the passion predictions. Yes, I'm going to be denied, betrayed, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise from the dead 3 days later. So Jesus was rolling out this concept of a resurrection. And to discredit him, okay, they pose a question they think would show the people how ridiculous this concept of a resurrection is. And because it's so ridiculous, and because Jesus is preaching on it, that makes Jesus ridiculous, and he'll be discredited. That's kind of how they think this question is going to work, all right? Now, but they're smart. They pose this question based on an actual law, okay? It's called the Levirate law of marriage. And it's part of the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, right? The law that the people had to obey. And this law said, look, if you've got a husband and a wife, and the husband dies, and they have no child, then the brother of the husband has to step in, marry the wife, have a child, and that child will be the dead husband's child, okay? Because having children was very, very important for 2 reasons. Number 1, it carried on the family name. It kept the lineage going, right? And if you had a child, when the parents died, the property, the land they owned would stay in the family. It would go to the child. So having at least one child was very important, okay? Well, what happens if a husband and wife, the husband died and there was no child, all right? The brother of the husband would have to step in, marry the wife, produce a child, and that would solve the problem, right? That was called the Levirate law of marriage, right? Well, the Sadducees take that and they raise it to an exaggerated degree. They say, okay, Jesus, this resurrection thing, this afterlife, this immortality that you're preaching, let me ask you a question, okay? Suppose you got a husband and wife, and the husband dies, right, without a child, and then the brother steps in, and he dies without producing a child, and another brother steps in, and he dies, and another brother steps in, and he dies, all right? And 7 people step in, marry this wife, but none of them produce children, okay? Now, suppose, now the wife eventually dies, right? Well, she's had 7 people be her husband. So in this resurrection you're talking about, who will be her husband? She's had 7 of them. Will it be the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one? And basically, by posing this exaggerated question to Jesus that was based on an actual law, okay, they would show how ridiculous this concept of a resurrection is, all right? So they figure, okay, we got Jesus backed into a corner because the woman's had 7 people step in and be her husband to try and produce, keep the lineage going, right? Well, which of the 7 is going to be her husband? And how do you decide? See, people? See how ridiculous the resurrection is? Okay. How does Jesus answer? Okay, Jesus says, look, number 1, you make one fundamental mistake. And the mistake you're making is saying that life in heaven is going to be the same as life on earth. And it's going to be completely different. In heaven, people will be like the angels. Let me hit the pause button here, okay? People do not become angels when they go to heaven. Now, some people say, no, that's not right because Jesus said they would. Notice the wording. He says, you will be like angels. He doesn't say you will become angels. You will be like angels, all right? Now, how will we be like angels? Because angels are pure spirits, okay? They don't have bodies. So there's going to be no sexual intercourse. And because there'll be no need to procreate once everybody's in heaven, there'll be no marriage and giving in marriage. So this whole business of all these brothers stepping in to marry the wife and to produce a child, that's a moot point in heaven, because heaven is not like earth. People are not going to be marrying and being given in marriage. They're not going to be procreating. So the very basis of your question is there's a flawed foundation. You're assuming life in heaven is going to be like life on earth, when really it's going to be completely different. So your question is fundamentally flawed to begin with, okay? Now, the other thing he mentions, okay, because the other thing that they didn't believe was this afterlife, okay? And Jesus, notice what Jesus does. Now, again, the Sadducees only believe in the first 5 books of the Bible. One of those books is Exodus. So Jesus says, okay, I've answered your resurrection question, right? You don't believe in the resurrection. You also don't believe in the afterlife. And you say there's really no proof in the first 5 books of the Bible about an afterlife? Well, actually, you're wrong on that too. Because in the book of Exodus, one of the first 5 books, there is proof of an afterlife. And it's specifically, he points him to Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, where God tells Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, at this point, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, naturally speaking, have long since died. But when God tells Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all right? God is not a God of the dead. He's a God of the living. He doesn't say, notice, God doesn't tell Moses, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph. I am the God, currently. So, but God is not a God of the dead, he's a God of the living. So if he is now the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that means they must be living. That means there is immortality, there is an afterlife, and he pulls that from one of the books that the Sadducees say doesn't have any proof. So he really discredits them, all right? And again, this is in the temple area in front of crowds. So if you're a member of the crowd, you've seen him discredit the Pharisees and the Herodians, turn their question completely around on them, and now you've seen him discredit the Sadducees by turning their question completely around on them. Now, at this point, certainly, the Jewish religious leaders would say, look, this business of sending different groups to try and discredit Jesus by trapping him with a question, it's obviously not working, because every single time we walk away, not only with egg on our face, we walk away with a 3-egg omelet on our face, right? But no, okay, here comes another group with another question. Verses 28 to 34, okay? Now, these are the experts in the law. They come up to him and pose a question that they think is going to trap him. Now, who are the experts in the law? The scribes, who are kind of the theologians of the day. They studied the law, they explained the law. And of course, the Pharisees, who came up with all the different laws to keep people from violating the covenant, right? So when the Bible says, experts in the law came up to Jesus, we're looking at scribes and Pharisees, all right? So they come up to him. And what do they think their foolproof question is to discredit him? They say, hey, what is the greatest commandment? We've got all these commandments, okay? What's the greatest commandment, okay? Now, Jesus does something interesting. They ask him in the singular, what is the greatest commandment? Singular, right? Notice Jesus answers in the plural. He gives them two. He says, love God, essentially love God, love your neighbor, okay? Jesus combines those two into one. Why is this significant? Because no other rabbi up to this time ever combined those two. Yes, love God. Yes, love your neighbor, right? Because loving God, that came from Deuteronomy. Loving your neighbor came from Leviticus, all right? So those were scriptural. Love God, love your neighbor. But Jesus combined them into one great commandment. And he's the first one to ever do that. And if you're a scribe and a Pharisee, that had to have thrown you, because that's not the answer you expected, okay? You expected Jesus to say, oh, well, love God or love your neighbor. Again, either or. Jesus gives them a both and, all right? The greatest commandment is loving God and loving your neighbor. Now, what makes this question answer even more interesting is if you look at remember, what is the greatest commandment, right? If you look at the 10 Commandments, the first 3 is love of God. The remaining 7 is love of neighbor. So the commandments are all about both, loving God and loving neighbor. So when Jesus says, when they say, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor, he's basically giving them all 10 commandments. Because the first 3 are love of God, the second 7, the remaining 7 are love of neighbor. Okay? So he's basically saying, hey, look at all the commandments. You've got to obey all the commandments. You can't pick and choose, all right? Wow. And then Jesus, okay, kind of rebukes them severely, right? Because after these last, now keep in mind, Jesus is in the temple area. He's teaching the crowds. One by one, these 3 groups have posed questions to try and discredit Jesus, and Jesus has turned the tables on them, right? So now Jesus, after fielding these 3 questions, now hits them with a stinging rebuke. And we find this rebuke in verses 37 to 40. Now, if you watched the last episode when we went through chapter 11, Jesus has already scorched them with one rebuke. He's called them hypocrites, right? So they've already been severely rebuked once before. But now Jesus ups the ante even more, right? Because in this rebuke, if you look at verses 37 to 40, all right, he's basically saying, look, don't be like these Jewish religious leaders. Why? Jesus rattles off a couple of things they do. Let's take a look at those things one by one. One of the things he says is, don't be like them because they like to wear long robes. Now, what's the business with long robes? What's the significance? Well, if you wore a long robe, okay, you can't work in a long robe, right? And you couldn't hurry in a long robe, all right? So basically, anybody that wore long robes back then, that was a sign of wealth. Because if you walked around all day in a long robe, you couldn't hurry any place, you couldn't work. You were leading a life of leisure and a life of no work. So long robes were a sign of wealth. And we already know a lot of these guys were getting wealthy when they were taking their cut of the merchants and the money changers in the temple. Then he said, don't be like them, because they like greetings in the marketplace. They like to be greeted in public. And they like to be greeted by being called rabbi. And the name rabbi means my great one. So this was a sign of their vanity. Their long robes were a sign of their wealth. The greeting, wanting to be greeted in the marketplace, that was a sign of their vanity, right? Their pridefulness. And then he says, don't be like them. They like to take the front seats in synagogues. Now, again, just like if, let's say you were at a dinner, all right? And you'd have you had a podium, and then you'd have people on either side of the speaker, kind of a dais, a podium in front, right? And if you were sitting on one of those front seats facing the crowd, that indicated you were a pretty important person, okay? Those are the seats that these guys like to take, okay? And again, by saying don't be like them because they do this, again, he's hitting at their pride, their vanity, their thirst for notoriety, popularity. And then he says, they take the highest places at the feasts. Don't be like them in doing that. Now, again, to kind of wrap our minds around this, think of like a state dinner or government or a formal reception, okay? Where you are seated is an indication of your kind of status and power, right? So let's say, you're at a wedding reception, right? You want to be seated at the table with the bride and groom. Failing that, you want to be seated at one of the tables next to them. If you're seated in the very back of the auditorium, the last table, that indicates your relative pecking order in the scheme of things, right? Well, feasts, these guys like to be sat at the head table. And that speaks to their vanity, their pridefulness, their thirst for notoriety and popularity, right? And then the most stinging rebuke of all he saves for last. He says, they devour the houses of widows. Now, what does that mean? Well, back then, if you were a rabbi, you didn't get paid for your teaching. You would have to have, let's say, a side job to earn your living. You didn't get paid to teach. Well, what some of these guys were doing is they were seeking out rich widows, and they were saying, you know something? There's no greater honor or glory than to support a rabbi in his teaching ministry. So they would try and convince rich widows to turn over all their money to support them. Okay? That's what devouring the houses of widows. So the rich widows would say, well, gosh, yes, if there's no greater honor or prestige to support a rabbi, here, I'll turn over all my money to you so you can teach God's people, right? Well, now you're destitute, and the rabbi's living large, right? So, and these are all the things these guys did. And Jesus is turning to the crowd after fielding questions from these guys, right? He now turns to the crowd and says, hey, look, don't be like them because they wear long robes. They like greetings in the marketplace. They like the front seats at synagogues. They like the highest places at feasts. They devour widows' homes, all right? And now we know what those meant. And Jesus is telling the crowds this. That was a stinging, scorching rebuke of them. So if you're one of these guys, right, this is Tuesday of Holy Week, all right, you've been made a fool of by Jesus and him turning your question against you, and you've been scorched. And all of this is happening in front of the crowds, all right? So now, if you're them, now your hatred of this guy is maxing out. Now you say, okay, we got to do whatever we need to do to get rid of this guy, up to and including killing. Okay? And then we'll wrap up the chapter. I know we're going up about 55 minutes, about a tad long. 41 to 44, the famous widow's mite. So again, he's in the temple area, right? And now he's in the part of the temple area where the temple treasury was. And if you want to picture this scene, you had an area in the temple, right? And it had 13 different collection boxes. 13 different, like St. Vincent de Paul boxes, okay? Each one was for a specific donation. If you wanted to donate to help feed the priests, you put it in this collection box. If you wanted to donate to the upkeep of the temple, you put it in this collection box. If you wanted to donate to the poor, you put it in this collection box. So picture this, you had an area of the temple where on the wall was 13 collection boxes with where the money would go to underneath each one. Now these collection boxes, very important here, they were made of brass. And the people, when they put their money into these various collection boxes for various things, they would put coinage in. So picture a Jewish person coming into this area of the temple saying, okay, I want to donate some money to the upkeep of the temple. You reach into your pocket, you bring out a bunch of coins, and you put them in this brass collection box. Well, coins on brass, they would make a lot of noise, right? So if you were a rich person and you wanted everybody around to know how much you're donating, all right, when you put all these big batch of coins, it would make a significant sound. It would be, that brass collection box would be rattling with the sound of your coins going down it for a while. So everybody around would go, whoa, man, that guy is making a large donation. All right? Now, what is Jesus? Who does Jesus? So he views these people making their large donations, right? And then he turns his attention, and there's one widow. And she puts in one little coin, barely makes any noise at all, right? And he turns to the disciples in the crowd and he says, look, that widow and her one small coin, all right, has donated more, has been more generous than all these rich people with all their tons of coins. Why? Because they're rich, they gave from their surplus. She gave from everything she had. That one coin to her represented more of her subsistence than all those coins did with those rich people, okay? Her giving was sacrificial. Their giving was not. So another teachable moment where he teaches his disciples in the crowd the importance of not only giving, but that giving be sacrificial, that you not give from your surplus, that you give from your want, all right? And that coin that the widow had, it would be like a penny. Picture a rich guy coming up, and he's got a freezer bag full of coins he's dumping into this brass thing, all right? And then you've got this widow dropping in a penny. And her giving, because it was sacrificial, was more generous than their freezer bag full of coins. So, a teaching to start with, a parable, a teaching to end with, the widow's mite, and in between, Jesus fields and turns around 3 more questions. So as chapter 12 ends in Mark's Gospel, and as Tuesday ends of Holy Week, picture this, Jesus and his disciples go back to Bethany to spend the night. The Jewish religious leaders go back to headquarters, and now they're going to say, look, we've been made fools of. We've been rebuked severely. This has happened all in front of the crowds. This guy has to be killed. So with those two contrasting, Jesus and his disciples the Jewish religious leaders. We'll finish chapter 12 in Mark. We'll end Tuesday of Holy Week. The next episode we get together, chapter 13, we'll be back. We'll be into Wednesday and Thursday of Holy Week. So with that, a little bit long, I know, but a lot going on in chapter 12. It's Holy Week, after all, in Mark's Gospel. Take care, God bless, and as always, thank you for watching Fresh Catholic Bible Study Series. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.